Story 1. The Footsteps Beneath. It began on an ordinary night. Anna moved into her old, inherited home just a week ago. A quiet two-story Victorian house perched on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by fields and dense woods. On her first night, she heard it, faint, steady footsteps in the floorboards below. She brushed it off as creaking pipes or settling wood. But every night after, like clockwork, the footsteps began around 2 a.m., always beneath her bed. They would shuffle slowly, almost rhythmically. When she moved to the living room one night, the footsteps followed. Every time she shifted rooms, they mirrored her, keeping just out of sight, just beneath her. One night, curiosity got the better of her. At 2 a.m., armed with a flashlight, she ventured into the basement. The musty air was thick with decay. The old house smelled of rot, and the stone walls seemed to breathe. As her light swept across the space, it caught something odd, a faint outline, a trapdoor she'd never noticed. Trembling, she pried it open. A ladder led down into darkness, far deeper than the house should have allowed. With a deep breath, she descended, step by agonizing step. The air grew colder, damper with each footfall. When her feet touched the ground, she found herself in a small chamber. And there, in the dim light, she saw them. Hundreds of footprints embedded into the dirt, as if the ground had been worn smooth from countless pacing. Before she could react, the footsteps started again, right behind her, loud and relentless. She turned, heart racing, but there was no one. Only the darkness moved, pressing in on her. A whisper, low and chilling, filled the room. "You're not supposed to be here." That was when she ran. But when she returned to the basement later with the police, the trapdoor was gone. There was no ladder, no chamber. Just the faint echo of footsteps in the walls, louder than ever. Story 2. The Lake's Watchful Eyes. Deep in the woods of Wisconsin lies a lake, untouched by modern civilization. Locals refuse to go near it, speaking only in hushed whispers about what lies beneath its tranquil surface. They call it Deadwater Lake, and for good reason. Jake and his friends weren't superstitious. They scoffed at the warnings and decided to camp by the lake for a weekend of fishing and stories. The first night was peaceful, campfire crackling, stars shimmering overhead. But as the moon reached its peak, the water became unnaturally still, almost like glass. The next morning, one of their friends, Lucas, was gone. His tent stood untouched, his shoes neatly placed by the entrance. The others assumed he had gone for a morning hike, but hours passed, and there was no sign of him. Panic set in. They searched the forest and called his name, but the only reply was the eerie stillness of the lake. That night they saw it, the figure. Standing on the water's surface, a pale silhouette, its eyes fixed on their camp. At first, they thought it was Lucas, but something was wrong. The figure was too still, too quiet. When they shone a flashlight toward it, the beam passed right through, distorting the reflection in the water. In a blind panic, they ran into the woods, leaving their tents and gear behind. The figure never moved, but its eyes followed them. By morning, Jake and his 2 remaining friends reached the nearest town. They went straight to the sheriff, only to be met with grim faces. "We warned you," was all the sheriff said before turning away. They never found Lucas. Jake swore he could still feel those eyes on him watching. He moved far from Wisconsin, but sometimes, in the dead of night, he swears he can hear the sound of rippling water right outside his window. Story 3. The Staring Man. Ella lived in a high-rise apartment in the city, her small one-bedroom apartment nestled on the 12th floor. Her life was routine, work, sleep, repeat. But something had begun to shift. For weeks she had felt it, a presence, a sense of being watched, though her windows faced nothing but the skyline. It started small, a fleeting reflection in the mirror, a shadow she couldn't explain. But it wasn't until late one night that she saw him, the man, standing at the edge of her balcony. Her heart raced as she backed away, eyes locked on the figure outside her glass door. He was impossibly tall, his face obscured by shadows, but his posture, it was wrong, stiff, and unnatural. His head was tilted like he was trying to see her better. She blinked, and he was gone. Shaken, she tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, maybe. But the next night, there he was again, closer this time, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the window. She screamed, running for the door, but by the time she turned back, the balcony was empty. She called the building's security, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing on the cameras. They dismissed her fears, but Ella knew what she saw. And it kept happening, night after night. Each time, the men appeared, closer and closer. One evening, she snapped, grabbing her phone to record. As she waited in the dark, heart pounding, the silhouette emerged again, his face fully visible for the first time. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and skin that looked stretched over bone. She screamed as he pressed a hand against the glass, cracking it. But when the lights came on and her neighbors rushed to help, there was no one there. Her phone had recorded nothing but static, and the glass was pristine. Yet she could feel it. The staring hadn't stopped. No matter where she moved, where she went, she always saw him in the corner of her eye, watching, waiting. Story 4. The Haunting of Room 46. The old hotel in the mountains had long been rumored to be haunted. Room 46, in particular, was infamous. The staff avoided it, and no guest had stayed there in decades. But when the winter storm rolled in, leaving Emma stranded with no other option, the hotel manager reluctantly handed her the key. The room was small and quaint, with a large window overlooking the snowy landscape. But the air felt heavy, as though something unseen was pressing down on her. The minute she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Emma laughed nervously, chalking it up to the draft. As night fell, the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma shivered under her blankets, but sleep was elusive. Around midnight, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking on the walls. She turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then she heard a whisper. Faint, barely audible at first, but growing louder. "Let me out." Her heart raced, and she stumbled to the door, trying to open it, but the knob wouldn't turn. Panic surged through her veins as the knocking became pounding, as if someone was trapped within the walls. Suddenly, the wardrobe door creaked open. Emma's eyes widened as a dark figure, half-formed and skeletal, crawled out, its hand outstretched toward her. The whispering intensified, a chorus of desperate voices, all repeating the same phrase, "Let me out." With a final burst of strength, she yanked the door open and fled down the hall, not stopping until she reached the lobby. The staff found her the next morning, huddled in a corner, shaking and incoherent. No one ever dared enter room 46 again. Story 5. The Hollow Ones. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there's a forgotten stretch of forest, so dense and isolated that even locals avoid it. They call it the Hollow Woods. Jared, an experienced hiker, loved exploring places like that, unmarked, untouched. The rumors about strange disappearances and whispers of hollow-eyed creatures didn't faze him. He thought it was just another urban legend, until he stepped foot inside. The first day was uneventful. The woods were dark and thick, with trees so ancient their bark looked like weathered stone. But as night fell, things began to change. The silence, so peaceful during the day, became oppressive. Not a single rustle of leaves, no chirp of insects, just a heavy, unnatural quiet. Around midnight, Jared heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. At first, he thought it was the wind, but it had a pulse, a cadence. He scanned the tree line with his flashlight but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. The forest felt alive. When he awoke the next morning, he found strange tracks around his tent. They weren't animal prints, and they weren't human either. Small, circular marks, as if something had been dragged across the ground. His skin prickled, but he convinced himself it was nothing. That night, the breathing returned, closer this time, more deliberate. He stayed awake, eyes fixed on the zipper of his tent. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just before dawn, he saw them. Pale figures, standing between the trees, motionless, watching. They had no eyes, just hollow sockets, and their skin looked stretched, paper-thin over their bones. Jared froze, heart pounding in his chest. The creatures didn't move, but they didn't need to. He felt their presence pressing on him, like the very air was being drained from his lungs. Without thinking, he grabbed his gear and ran. For hours, he stumbled through the forest, but no matter which direction he went, the hollow-eyed figures were always there, watching from the shadows. When he finally broke through the trees into a clearing, he collapsed from exhaustion. the figures didn't follow. He never spoke of what happened in the hollow woods, but when asked about the scars on his back, all he would say was, "They almost took me, but they're still there, watching." Story 6. The Attic Door. After her grandmother passed away, Leela inherited the old family home. It was a grand, sprawling estate, but it had always made her uncomfortable as a child, especially the attic. Her grandmother had warned her to never open the attic door, saying it was better left locked. But now, with the house in her hands, curiosity got the better of her. The first few nights were uneventful, the house creaking like any old home would. But that sense of unease gnawed at her, especially when she passed the attic stairs. The door was heavy old wood with a rusted keyhole, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Late one night, as Leela lay in bed, she heard a soft thumping sound coming from above. At first, she thought it was just the wind or perhaps the house settling. But the noise persisted, a steady, deliberate knock, as if someone was gently tapping on the attic door from inside. She tried to ignore it, but every night the knocking grew louder, more insistent. And one night she heard something else, footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps right above her, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. She couldn't sleep, her heart pounding with dread. Finally, she decided to confront whatever was making the noise. Armed with a flashlight and trembling hands, she ascended the narrow stairs. As she approached the attic door, the knocking stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment she hesitated, but then she turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the attic was just as she remembered, dusty and cluttered with old furniture and forgotten memories. But in the corner, something caught her eye. There, partially hidden beneath an old sheet, was a large ornate mirror. The frame was covered in dust, but the glass was perfectly clean. As she moved closer, Leela felt a chill run down her spine. The air around the mirror was colder than the rest of the attic, and when she looked into it, she didn't see her own reflection. Instead, she saw a figure, a woman, gaunt and pale, staring back at her with hollow eyes. Before she could react, the woman in the mirror began to move, her hand reaching toward the glass, pressing against it from the inside. Leela stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and as she did, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Now, trapped in the dark, she could hear the knocking again. Only this time, it was coming from behind the mirror. Story 7. The Screaming Fields. The fields stretched for miles behind Jeremy's family farm, a flat expanse of wheat that swayed in the wind. As a child, he had heard the stories about the screaming fields, tales of strange sounds and inexplicable disappearances, but he had never believed them. That is, until the night he heard the screams for himself. It was late autumn, and Jeremy had been working late, trying to bring in the last of the harvest. The sky was a deep purple, and a cold breeze swept across the land. As he packed up his tools, he heard it, faint at first, like a distant wail carried on the wind. He froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the howl of the wind, it was a scream. Unearthly, high-pitched, and filled with pain. Jeremy's first thought was that someone was hurt, maybe an animal caught in the machinery. But as he walked into the field, the sound didn't seem to come from any one place. It echoed around him, filling the air, but there was no source. The wheat rustled violently, though there was no wind now. His pulse quickened as the screams became more desperate, more human. He broke into a run, pushing through the stalks, calling out to anyone who might be trapped or injured. But there was no answer, only more screams, now surrounding him on all sides. The wheat seemed to close in, taller than it should have been, and soon he couldn't see the farmhouse lights anymore. In a panic, Jeremy turned to run back, but the ground beneath him shifted, softening like mud. He stumbled, falling to his knees, and that's when he saw it, a hand, pale and thin, reaching up from the earth, fingers clawing at the air. Then another and another. Soon, the ground was alive with grasping hands, pulling at his legs, his clothes, dragging him down into the soil. As the dirt filled his mouth, muffling his screams, Jeremy heard one last sound above him, the wind, now calm, whispering through the wheat. And then nothing. The field was quiet once more. Story 8. The Man in the Mist. In the small town of Coldwater, Maine, the mist was a regular occurrence. It rolled in from the coast every few weeks, thick and heavy, turning the world into a pale, shapeless haze. Most people stayed indoors when the mist came, but not Eleanor. She had grown up in cold water and wasn't afraid of a little fog. One evening, as the mist crept through the streets, she decided to take a walk. The town was eerily quiet, the usual sounds muffled by the dense fog. As she wandered, something caught her eye, a figure, barely visible through the mist, standing near the old church. At first, she thought it was just a neighbor, but the way the figure moved was strange, too slow, too deliberate. It seemed to glide, rather than walk, disappearing and reappearing in the swirling mist. Curious, Eleanor followed, but no matter how fast she walked, the figure stayed just out of reach, always at the edge of her vision. Her footsteps quickened, but so did her unease. The town seemed to stretch on forever, streets she had known her entire life twisting and turning into unfamiliar paths. And all the while, the figure was there, silent, watching. Eventually, she found herself near the docks, the mist thicker than ever. The figure was closer now, and as she approached, she saw him clearly for the first time. A tall man in a long coat, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were hollow, like deep wells of shadow. Before she could turn away, he spoke. His voice was soft, barely audible over the lapping waves, but the words chilled her to the bone. "You've come too far," he whispered, "and now you'll never leave." Eleanor ran, heart pounding, but no matter how fast she moved, the mist seemed to cling to her, suffocating her. When she finally burst through the fog, she was back at the church, alone. The figure was gone. But the mist never truly left, and each time it returned, so did he, waiting in the fog, watching. Story 9. The Flickering Room. When Natalie moved into her new apartment, everything seemed perfect. It was small but cozy, and it came at a price she couldn't pass up. There was just one odd thing about the place, the second bedroom. It wasn't anything obvious at first, but there was a strange sensation whenever she stepped inside, like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. The landlord had shrugged it off, telling how it had been a storage room for years. She didn't think much of it. The first night in her new home, she noticed the lights flickering in the hallway. At first, she thought it was an electrical issue, but the flicker seemed purposeful, almost like a heartbeat, a steady rhythm. As she walked down the hall to investigate, the flickering intensified, growing brighter as she neared the second bedroom. When she opened the door, the room was bathed in a dim light, the bulbs pulsing in and out of darkness. Natalie hesitated but stepped inside. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the lights went out completely. She stood in the pitch-black room, her breath shallow, straining to hear something, anything. But there was only silence. Then came the faintest whisper. It was so soft she thought she imagined it at first. But it grew louder, clearer, a voice, low and raspy, repeating the same words over and over. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Natalie's heart raced, and she fumbled for the light switch. When the lights flickered back on, she was alone. Shaken, she hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She told herself it was her imagination, that the stress of the move was playing tricks on her. But every night, the lights flickered. Every night, the whispers returned, more insistent, more demanding. And each time she opened the door, the room seemed darker, colder, as though something was waiting for her inside. One night, determined to prove to herself that nothing was wrong, she set up a camera in the room. She left it recording overnight, trying to ignore the flickering lights and the growing sense of dread. The next morning, she nervously watched the footage. For hours, nothing happened. The room was still silent. But then, around 3 a.m., the screen flickered. A shadow appeared in the corner of the room, barely visible at first, but it grew, darkening until it swallowed the entire frame. And then, from the darkness, a face emerged, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, staring directly into the camera. The footage ended with a single word, whispered so clearly it sent chills down her spine. "Mine." Natalie never went back into the room again. A week later, she moved out. But sometimes, late at night, when she's drifting off to sleep, she swears she can still hear the flicker of lights and that same chilling whisper. Story 10. The Watchers in the Graveyard. The town of Ash Hollow had a cemetery that stretched for miles, an ancient, sprawling graveyard where the headstones crumbled and the mausoleums stood like sentinels over the dead. No one visited the cemetery after dark, not anymore, not since the disappearances started. For decades, people had gone missing near the graveyard, wanderers, teenagers daring each other for a thrill, even a few locals who strayed too close after sunset. The police searched, but they never found a trace of the missing. There was only one clue, spoken in hushed tones by those who lived nearby, the Watchers. Sam didn't believe in local legends. He and his friends had heard the stories, but they were just that, stories. One night, in search of a good scare, they decided to spend the night in the graveyard. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and a bottle of whiskey, they set up camp near one of the oldest mausoleums. The night was cold, the wind howling through the headstones, but the boys laughed and joked, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. As midnight approached, the laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The wind died down, leaving the cemetery in an unnatural silence. Then Sam saw them. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows moving among the tombstones. But as he stared, he realized they weren't shadows at all. They were figures tall and thin, their features hidden by the night, standing perfectly still just beyond the edge of the light cast by their fire. "Who's there?" Sam called, his voice trembling. No answer. The figures didn't move. They only watched. Panic set in as his friends noticed the figures too, but when they shone their flashlights toward them, the beams passed through the shapes, hitting nothing but empty air. And yet, the Watchers remained, unmoving, their presence heavy and oppressive. Desperate, Sam and his friends scrambled to pack up and leave, but the figures began to move, slowly, methodically, closing the distance. Every time Sam turned around, they were closer, their forms growing more defined in the moonlight. Their faces were blank, featureless, but their hollow eyes were wide, unblinking. By the time they reached the cemetery gate, Sam was alone. He didn't know when he had lost his friends. One moment, they were running beside him. The next, they were gone, swallowed by the dark. He screamed their names into the night, but the only reply was the distant rustle of dead leaves. Years later, Sam is the only one left who knows the truth of what happened that night. The police never found his friends, and the townsfolk continued to speak of the Watchers in hushed tones. But Sam knows they're still out there, standing silent among the graves, waiting. Story 11. The Dollmaker's Curse. In a small, forgotten town nestled in the mountains, there lived an old man known as the Dollmaker. His shop was filled with hundreds of dolls, delicate, porcelain creations that were said to be so lifelike, they seemed to move when no one was looking. Children loved the dolls, and parents traveled from far and wide to buy one for their little ones. But there was a dark secret behind the dollmaker's craft. Claire had grown up hearing the stories about the dollmaker, but she had never believed them. She thought they were just tales to scare the children into behaving. But when her grandmother passed away, leaving her one of the old dolls, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. The doll was beautiful, with glossy black hair, pale skin, and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow her around the room. Claire tried to put it on a shelf, but every time she walked by, she swore the doll had moved. Sometimes its head was tilted in a different direction, its eyes pointed somewhere new. Once, she even found it sitting in the middle of the room, though she had left it on the shelf. As the days went by, Claire began hearing strange noises at night. Soft footsteps, a faint tapping, like tiny hands brushing against the walls. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the noises grew louder, more insistent. And always, they seemed to come from the direction of the doll. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, Claire locked the doll in a chest and shoved it into the attic. She slept peacefully for the first time in days, but when she woke the next morning, the doll was sitting at the foot of her bed, its blue eyes fixed on her. Panicked, she called an antiques expert to appraise the doll, hoping to find an explanation. The man arrived the next day, his face growing pale the moment he laid eyes on the doll. This is one of his," the man whispered, trembling. "The dollmaker's last creations. They say he trapped souls inside them." Claire laughed nervously, but the man's expression was grave. "You need to get rid of it. Burn it. Bury it. Just don't keep it." That night, Claire took the doll to the woods and buried it deep beneath the earth. She thought it was over. But the next morning, the doll was waiting for her, its glassy eyes gleaming from her kitchen table. The dollmaker's curse had claimed another soul. Story 12. The Mirror Room. When Amy's family moved into the old Victorian house, there was one room they avoided, an upstairs bedroom lined entirely with mirrors. No one knew why the room existed, but it had been left untouched for decades, the mirrors covered in dust and grime. Curiosity got the better of Amy one day. She opened the door, and as the light streamed in, it illuminated dozens of mirrors, their reflections distorted and dark. She felt a strange pull, like the room was beckoning her to come inside. Against her better judgment, she stepped in. As soon as she entered, the door slammed shut behind her. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen force. She turned to leave, but her reflection in the nearest mirror didn't move. Annie froze, her heart pounding as she watched her mirrored self grin. An eerie, unnatural smile. She reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as her reflection began to move on its own, tilting its head and watching her with cold, dark eyes. Slowly, it raised its hand, pressing it against the glass from the inside, as if trying to break through. Amy screamed, pounding on the door, but no one could hear her. Her reflection grinned wider, its eyes narrowing as it began to step forward, coming closer to the glass. She could feel it, the cold, creeping sensation of something reaching for her from within the mirror. The last thing Emmy saw before the world went black was her reflection's hand passing through the glass, pulling her in. When her family finally opened the door, the room was empty, save for the mirrors. And in one of them, they saw her, trapped, her hands pressed against the glass, screaming silently from the other side. Story 13, The Midnight Collar. In the quiet suburb of Maple Grove, there was a peculiar legend. It was said that every 10 years, on a cold autumn night, the midnight collar would come. No one knew who or what the collar was, only that those who heard the knock on their door never spoke of it again. For years, it was just a tale told by teenagers to scare one another. But when the knocks began again, things changed. Megan had lived in Maple Grove for 5 years. She had heard the stories, but never thought much of them. Until one night, while sitting alone in her living room, she heard a knock at her door, 3 sharp, deliberate taps that echoed through the house. She glanced at the clock. 12:00 a.m. exactly. A chill ran down her spine. Her hand hovered over her phone, debating whether to call someone, but then she scolded herself for being paranoid. Still, her heart raced as she approached the door. When she peeked through the peephole, no one was there. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering streetlight. Nervously, she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, her breath visible in the cold air. Nothing, just silence. Relieved, she shut the door and turned away. But as she walked back into the living room, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. She froze, her skin prickling. Slowly, she turned back to the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Knock, knock, knock. When she opened the door again, the street was still empty. But this time, something was different. A small envelope lay on the doorstep, its edges frayed and yellowed. Trembling, Megan picked it up. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded and worn. It read, "Do not open the door after midnight. The next knock will be your last." Her blood ran cold. She slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as the house seemed to close in on her. Minutes passed, but the quiet felt suffocating. Then, just as she began to calm down, the third knock came. This time, it shook the entire door. Megan didn't dare move. She stood in the center of the room, paralyzed with fear. The knocking continued, relentless now, rattling the walls. She clutched the letter in her hand, her pulse racing, and squeezed her eyes shut. Then, suddenly, the knocking stopped. When she opened her eyes, the house was still. The clock ticked past 12:30 a.m., and there was nothing but silence. She let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over. But when she turned toward the hallway, she saw it, her reflection in the mirror. Only it wasn't her. The figure in the mirror grinned back at her, its eyes wide, black and hollow. The next morning, the police found her door wide open. There was no sign of Megan, only a shattered mirror, and the faint sound of knocking echoing through the empty house. Story 14, The Shadow at the Window. Greg had just moved into his new apartment in the city. It wasn't anything special, just a small place on the 3rd floor of an old building, with a view of the street below. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. But then he started noticing the shadow. Every night, just after 11 p.m., he would catch a glimpse of it in his window, a dark figure standing outside, staring in. At first, Greg dismissed it as a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow from a passing car. But the figure was always there, motionless, watching. One night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Greg decided to confront it. He flicked on the light and walked over to the window, but as he approached, the figure disappeared. He looked down at the empty street below. There was no one there. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. Disturbed, Greg closed the blinds and tried to forget about it. But the next night, the shadow returned. This time, it was closer, its outline sharper, more defined. It seemed to press against the glass, its face obscured, but its eyes, too dark, glistening orbs, were unmistakable. Greg's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, intending to take a picture, but the moment he raised it, the figure vanished again. For days, the pattern repeated. No matter how quickly he tried to catch it, the shadow was always gone before he could confront it. But each night, it grew bolder, pressing closer to the glass, lingering longer, until one night, it didn't disappear at all. Greg stood frozen, staring at the shadow. It was no longer just a vague shape. It had form now, tall, thin, with long fingers that pressed against the window pane. Its face was still hidden, but Greg could feel its eyes on him, burning through the glass. His breath caught in his throat as the figure reached up and tapped on the window, once, twice, 3 times. The glass shuddered beneath the pressure, but it didn't break. Greg backed away, heart racing, but he couldn't look away. The figure remained, its hand still pressed to the glass, tapping again, harder this time. He ran for the door, but before he could reach it, the lights in the apartment flickered and everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the window was empty, but Greg wasn't alone. He could feel a presence behind him, cold breath on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, and there it was, the shadow, standing inches away from him, its face now visible, twisted into a grotesque smile. The next morning, Greg's apartment was empty, the blinds torn from the windows, the door wide open. Neighbors reported hearing a single loud crash, followed by silence. No one ever saw Greg again, but sometimes, late at night, people passing by his window claimed to see a shadow staring out from the darkness. Story 15. The Well in the Woods. In the dense woods behind his grandparents' farmhouse, Oliver had discovered something strange as a child. A well, overgrown and hidden by thick brush, far from any path. The well had always unnerved him. It wasn't just its age or the way the stones seemed to shift in the light. It was the fact that, no matter how much he strained his ears, he could never hear the bottom. As a boy, he would throw stones into it, listening for the splash that never came. The sound would simply disappear into the darkness. Now, as an adult, Oliver had returned to the farmhouse after his grandfather's death. The memories of the well resurfaced, and though he tried to shake them, something about it called to him. On the last night of his stay, driven by a strange compulsion, he ventured into the woods. It was just as he remembered, the old stones slick with moss, the air around the well strangely still. Oliver stood at the edge, peering into the inky blackness, feeling that same unsettling pull he had felt as a child. Without thinking, he picked up a small rock and dropped it into the well, waiting for the familiar silence. But this time he heard something. Not a splash, but a faint sound, like a voice, calling from deep below. He froze, straining to listen. The voice grew clearer, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, soft and mournful, begging for help. "Please, let me out." Oliver's heart raced. He knew it couldn't be possible. There was no way anyone could be down there. And yet, the voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Please, help me." Against his better judgment, he found himself tying a rope around a nearby tree and lowering himself into the well. The descent was slow, the air growing colder and damper as he went deeper. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him. About halfway down, the rope jerked violently, pulling him to a stop. He hung there, breathless, when the voice came again, this time right beside his ear. "You shouldn't have come." Terrified, Oliver tried to climb back up, but the rope slipped through his hands. As he scrambled for a hold, the stones beneath his fingers shifted, revealing something buried in the wall, a skeletal hand reaching out from the cracks in the stone. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the well as the walls began to close in around him. The next morning, the well was empty. No one ever saw Oliver again, though the rope still dangled from the tree, leading down into the bottomless pit. And sometimes, in the still of the night, if you stand close enough, you can still hear the whispers from deep below, begging for release. Story 16. The room that wasn't there. James had been apartment hunting for weeks when he finally found the perfect place, a quaint old building on the outskirts of the city with a rent so cheap he thought it was a mistake. But the landlord assured him it was correct. It's an old place after all. Not many people want to live here anymore, the man said with a peculiar smile. James didn't mind the age of the building. It had character. The apartment was small but cozy, with high ceilings and vintage wooden floors. There was only one odd thing: a door at the end of the hallway that didn't lead anywhere. It was completely sealed, no doorknob, no keyhole, just a flat door flush with the wall. When he asked the landlord about it, the old man only shrugged. It's just part of the old architecture. Doesn't open, never did. James moved in the next day. The first night was quiet, uneventful. But by the second night, strange things started happening. At exactly 3 a.m., James heard a faint thumping sound, like someone knocking softly from behind the sealed door. He dismissed it as old pipes of a building settling, but the knocking persisted each night, always at the same time. By the fourth night, it wasn't just knocking. James began to hear voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from behind the door. He pressed his ear to the wood but could never make out what they were saying, just a steady stream of soft murmurs that filled the dark hallway. Determined to put an end to it, he decided to open the door, even if it meant tearing it down. Armed with a crowbar, he pried at the edges of the frame. The wood splintered under the pressure, and after an hour of hard work, he finally broke through. The door creaked open to reveal nothing. No hidden room, no extra space, just a solid wall of bricks behind it. Confused and frustrated, James stepped back, staring at the bricked-up doorway. That night, the knocking came again, louder, more frantic. It rattled the door so hard, the hinges shook. James bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and raced into the hallway. The knocking stopped as he approached, but something was different this time. The door wasn't sealed anymore. It stood slightly ajar, a thin crack of darkness peeking through. James stared at it, too terrified to move. Slowly, the door creaked open wider, revealing not the brick wall he had seen before, but a dark, endless corridor that seemed to stretch into nothingness. From the depths of the corridor came the faint sound of footsteps growing closer. The next morning, James was gone. The apartment was empty, the door at the end of the hall completely sealed once again. No one has lived there since, but late at night, passers-by claim they can still hear the knocking, soft, persistent, and growing louder with each passing year. Story 17. The Whispering Man. It started with a dream. Sarah had been living in her new house for a few months when the nightmares began. Every night, she dreamed of a man standing at the foot of her bed. His face was always obscured by shadow, but his presence was suffocating. He never spoke, just watched, his silence more terrifying than words. But after a week, the dream changed. The man began to whisper. At first, it was incoherent, just a low murmur that seemed to slither into her mind as she slept. But slowly, the words became clearer. He whispered her name over and over in a voice that was not quite human, harsh, guttural, as though the very act of speaking pained him. Every time Sarah woke, the whispers lingered, echoing in the corners of her mind, filling the silence of her home. She tried to shake them off, but they followed her, growing louder, more insistent, until she began hearing them while awake. One night, she woke with a start, her room drenched in darkness. The whispers were louder than ever, circling her, closing in. She sat up, eyes scanning the room. That's when she saw him. The man from her dreams, standing in the doorway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He whispered her name, and for the first time she could see his face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. His mouth moved in slow, deliberate motions, forming words that dripped like poison from his lips. Terrified, Sarah leaped out of bed and flipped on the light, but when she turned back, he was gone. The room was empty, but the whispers remained, louder than ever, surrounding her like a chorus of malevolent voices. She moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. But no matter where she went, the whispers followed. At first, they were faint, easily ignored. But with each passing night, they grew louder until the sound of her name echoed in every corner of her new home. The whispering man had found her, and he would never leave. Story 18. The Window That Watches. The old house had stood at the edge of the forest for over a century, abandoned for most of it. No one dared go near it. Stories of strange occurrences and disappearances had plagued the property for years. But when Mark's family moved into town, they didn't believe in ghosts. They bought the house at a low price, ignoring the warnings from the locals. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was old but sturdy, with large windows that overlooked the vast woods. Mark's room had the best view. His window faced the trees, offering a picturesque landscape. But after a few days, Mark started noticing something strange. Every night, when the house was silent and dark, his window would creak open on its own. No matter how tightly he locked it, no matter how many times he checked, it would always be slightly ajar in the morning. One night, as he lay in bed, Mark heard a soft tap on the glass. Startled, he sat up, but when he looked out the window, there was nothing but darkness. He told himself it was just the wind, but the tapping continued, gentle at first, then louder, more insistent. Mark got up and approached the window cautiously. He peered outside, expecting to see a branch or maybe an animal, but the forest was still. Just as he was about to close the window, something caught his eye, movement deep within the trees. He squinted, trying to make it out. A figure, pale and thin, standing just at the edge of the woods, its eyes locked on his window. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Heart pounding, he slammed the window shut and pulled the curtains closed. But that night, the tapping continued, louder than ever, like fingers drumming on the glass. Mark lay awake, too afraid to look, praying for morning to come. When he finally worked up the courage to peek through the curtains, the figure was gone. But the next night, and the one after that, it returned. Always watching, always waiting. The more Mark tried to ignore it, the closer the figure seemed to get. It no longer stood at the edge of the forest. Now it was halfway across the yard, its hollow eyes fixed on him, even through the curtains. One night, Mark woke to find the window wide open. The figure was standing just outside, its hand resting on the sill, long fingers tapping against the glass. This time, it smiled. By morning, Mark was gone. His bed was empty, the window still open, a trail of dirt leading from the floor to the trees. The house stood vacant once more, the window watching, waiting for its next occupant. Story 19. The Voices in the Walls. Claire had always been a light sleeper, so when she moved into the old townhouse, the creaks and groans of the building didn't bother her at first. But as the days went on, she noticed something peculiar, soft, muffled voices, like a conversation happening just beyond her reach. At first, she thought it was the neighbors, though the walls seemed too thick for sound to travel. But the voices were strange, hushed, and unintelligible. They seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, rising and falling as if in a distant argument. One night, Claire pressed her ear to the wall, trying to make out the words. The voices were faint, like whispers carried on a cold breeze, but as she listened closer, she could swear she heard her own name. The thought chilled her. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the voices grew louder with each passing night, and soon, they weren't just coming from the walls. They were in the ceiling, the floor, all around her, like the house itself was speaking. Desperate for sleep, Claire called a contractor, convinced there was some hidden vent or pipe carrying sound through the house. But after a thorough inspection, the contractor found nothing, no gaps, no hollow spaces, just solid wood and brick. That night, the voices returned, louder than ever. This time, they were clear, angry, pleading, and desperate. And they were calling her name. Terrified, Claire grabbed her things and fled the house, vowing never to return. But as she stepped outside, she heard a new sound, the walls of the house groaning, as if something inside was trying to break free. The voices followed her for weeks. No matter where she went, she could hear them, faint, muffled, always just out of reach. And every night, when she closed her eyes, the walls of her new home seemed to whisper, calling her back. Story 20. The Sleepless Ones. Elliot moved to a sleepy coastal town, hoping for some peace after years of the city's chaos. The town seemed perfect, quiet, calm, with the sound of the ocean lulling him to sleep each night. But as summer drifted into autumn, Elliot noticed something strange. No one in the town slept. He first realized it when he took a midnight walk along the beach. The houses that lined the shore had their lights on, every window glowing well past midnight. He assumed it was just a coincidence, until it happened again the next night, and the night after that. It wasn't just a few houses, it was every house. He asked his neighbors about it casually, but they only smiled politely and changed the subject. His questions were always met with vague answers or distracted laughter. No one ever spoke about sleep. One night, as Elliot sat by his window, staring out into the moonlit streets, he saw them. People, dozens of them, wandering the streets at odd hours, their faces pale, their eyes wide open. They moved slowly, almost in a trance, their feet shuffling along the pavement. Curious and a little unnerved, Elliot followed them. They led him through the town, their footsteps silent despite the gravel underfoot. No one spoke, no one acknowledged each other. It was as if they were drawn to something, pulled by an unseen force. The group stopped at the edge of the woods, where the trees loomed like dark sentinels. One by one, they disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the shadows. Elliot hesitated, his heart racing, but the pull was irresistible. He followed. Deep in the woods, the trees parted to reveal an old stone ruin, crumbling and forgotten, covered in thick vines. In the center of the ruin stood a single stone altar, worn smooth by time. The townspeople gathered around it, their eyes fixed on the dark sky above, where a strange, shimmering light pulsed faintly. Elliot felt a pressure building in the air, a hum that vibrated through the ground. The townspeople began to murmur, their voices low and rhythmic, chanting words he couldn't understand. The pulsing light above the altar grew brighter, and with it, a deep, oppressive silence fell over the clearing. Suddenly, one of the townspeople collapsed, their body limp and lifeless. No one reacted. Another fell, then another, their faces still locked in that eerie, sleepless stare. Elliot's heart pounded as he backed away, the realization sinking in. They weren't alive. They hadn't been for a long time. Terrified, Elliot ran back to his house, locking every door and window. But the sleepless ones knew. Every night after, he would hear the shuffling footsteps outside his home, the faint chant carried on the wind, growing louder, closer. One morning, the mailman found Elliot sitting on his porch, staring out at the town. His eyes were wide open, dark circles etched beneath them. He wasn't asleep. He never would be again. Story 21. The Pale Child. It was the dead of winter when Lydia first saw the child. She lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was peaceful there, the snow-covered trees surrounding her like a fortress of silence. But one night, as she stared out the window, she saw him, a small figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of her porch light. A child, no more than 8 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His skin was as white as the snow, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at her. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She opened the door, calling out to him, but he didn't respond. She took a step outside, but the moment her foot touched the snow, the boy turned and vanished into the woods without a sound, leaving no footprints behind. Over the next few days, Lydia couldn't shake the image of the boy from her mind. She asked around in town, but no one knew of any missing children. They all gave her the same warning, don't go looking for things out there. But the boy kept returning. Every night, he would appear at the edge of the trees, closer each time. He never spoke, never moved, just stared with those dark, empty eyes. Lydia began to dread nightfall, the silence of the woods suffocating her as she waited for him to show up. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her coat, she stormed out into the snow, determined to find out who, or what, the boy was. She followed his pale figure into the woods, her breath visible in the freezing air. The deeper she went, the thicker the trees became, closing in around her. The boy led her to a small clearing, where the snow was undisturbed, untouched by any human or animal. In the center of the clearing was an old, half-buried well, its stones slick with ice. The boy stood beside it, his gaze fixed on the well's dark mouth. Lydia approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she peered into the well, she saw nothing but darkness. No sound, no movement, just an endless void. But then she heard it, a faint cry, echoing from deep below, like the wail of a child. She looked up at the boy, and for the first time he spoke. "They took me." Before Lydia could react, the boy's pale hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with icy fingers. His grip was impossibly strong, pulling her toward the well. She struggled, but the ground beneath her feet crumbled, and with a final desperate scream, she was dragged into the darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found her footprints leading into the woods, but they stopped abruptly at the old well. No sign of Lydia, no trace of her body. Only the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing through the trees. Story 22. The phone that never rang. Brian's father had always been a distant man, emotionally and physically. When he passed away unexpectedly, Brian inherited his old house, a creaky two-story home in a small, forgotten town. The house was filled with relics of his father's life, but the one thing that stood out was the rotary phone in the study. It was an antique, with its heavy receiver and faded dial, completely out of place in the modern world. Yet the phone held a strange allure for Brian. It wasn't connected to any landline, yet it remained on his father's desk, pristine and polished. One night, after sorting through boxes of old papers and books, Brian found himself sitting in the study, staring at the phone. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He reached out and touched the receiver, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Suddenly, the phone rang. The sharp mechanical sound echoed through the room, making Brian jump. He stared at it in disbelief. The phone wasn't connected. How could it be ringing? His hand hovered over the receiver, and after a moment's hesitation, he picked it up. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. At first, there was only silence. Then, a faint crackling sound, like static on an old radio. And then, a voice. Brian. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was his father's voice. Brian's heart raced. "Dad," he whispered, gripping the receiver tightly. "Is that you?" The static grew louder, and his father's voice came again, distorted, distant. "You shouldn't have come back." "What do you mean? What's going on?" Brian demanded, but the voice faded, replaced by a high-pitched whine that sent shivers down his spine. The line went dead. Brian stared at the phone, his mind racing. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an old recording, something left behind on a voicemail. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. His father had spoken to him. Over the next few days, the phone rang at the same time every night, always at 1:00 a.m., and each time, the voice on the other end grew clearer, more insistent. Leave the house. Brian couldn't bring himself to leave. It was his father's home, and he felt a strange pull to stay, to understand. But the more he stayed, the more the phone calls escalated. The voice became desperate, warning him of something terrible lurking in the house. Then one night, the phone didn't ring. The silence was worse. The house felt oppressive, the air thick with an unseen presence. As Brian sat in the study, staring at the phone, it suddenly fell from the desk, landing with a heavy thud on the floor. That's when he saw it, the dark figure standing in the corner of the room, just behind the desk, watching him. Its eyes were hollow, its shape barely more than a shadow, but its presence filled the room with a bone-chilling cold. Brian never returned to the house after that night. The phone calls stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Even now, years later, he wakes up at 1:00 a.m., half expecting to hear the phone ring again. Story 23. The House That Swallowed Them. Maya and Jake had always dreamed of owning a house in the country, far from the noise and bustle of the city. When they found the old Victorian manor nestled deep in the hills, it seemed too good to be true. The house was massive, with dozens of rooms and sprawling grounds. It needed work, but it had potential. The locals told them to avoid the house, that it had a dark history, but they didn't listen. Legends of disappearances and ghostly sightings didn't scare them, they chalked it up to small-town superstition. They moved in on a crisp autumn day. At first, everything seemed perfect, but soon strange things started happening. Doors would close on their own, locks would turn without anyone touching them, and at night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways. Maya and Jake laughed it off, attributing it to the house's age, but the events grew more unsettling. One night, Jake woke up to find Maya standing in the hallway, staring at one of the closed doors. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I heard something," she whispered, her hand resting on the doorknob. "It's coming from this room." Jake frowned. The room she was pointing to was one they hadn't explored yet. The door had been locked since they moved in, and they didn't have the key. Curiosity piqued, Jake searched the house the next day and found an old skeleton key hidden in a drawer. That night, they opened the door. The room was empty, just dust and cobwebs, but the air inside felt wrong, heavy, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far wall. They pressed their ears to the plaster, and the sound grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the wall cracked, a jagged line splitting down the middle. Maya screamed as the crack widened, revealing something behind it, a dark void, an endless blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. Before they could react, the darkness reached out. It was alive, pulling at them, dragging them toward the gaping hole in the wall. Maya and Jake were never seen again. The house was eventually abandoned, left to rot in the hills, its windows dark and hollow. But on quiet nights, when the wind dies down and the air is still, locals swear they can hear the house breathing, its walls alive with the whispers of those it has swallowed. Story 24. The Figures in the Fog. Living near the coastline, Emily was used to the thick fog that rolled in during the colder months. It would sweep over the cliffs and blanket the town, turning everything into a sea of grey. People always warned her not to go walking at night when the fog was thickest, but she had never paid much attention to the old wives' tales. One evening, Emily found herself wandering along the cliffs as the fog crept in. It was unusually dense that night, swallowing up the path ahead. The air felt heavy, and the silence was deafening. No waves, no wind, just the oppressive weight of the fog around her. As she turned to head back, something caught her eye. A figure, barely visible, standing still in the distance, shrouded in mist. Her breath hitched, but she brushed it off. Someone else out for an evening walk, perhaps. But as she walked, she noticed more figures, dozens of them, emerging from the fog, scattered across the cliffs like statues. They were all standing perfectly still, facing her, their outlines blurred but unmistakably human. Emily's pace quickened. She told herself it was just the fog playing tricks on her, but no matter how fast she walked, the figures seemed to get closer. Their faces were obscured, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching from behind the veil of mist. By the time she reached the edge of town, she was running. The figures were following her now, moving silently through the fog, their movements slowed but deliberate. They never made a sound, no footsteps, no rustle of clothes, just silent, ghostly shadows inching closer. Panicking, Emily burst into her house and slammed the door behind her. She peered out the window, her heart pounding, but the street was empty. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, but there were no figures in sight. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but that night, as she lay in bed, the fog crept in again. This time, it seeped through the cracks of her window, curling like tendrils of smoke around her room. And from the fog, she saw them, those same figures, standing at the foot of her bed, their faces now clear. They were not human. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her house was found empty, her bed still neatly made. The only sign she had ever been, there was a single footprint in the wet ground outside, leading into the fog. Story 25. The Thing in the Walls. Jack had always been a handyman, buying old houses, fixing them up, and selling them for a profit. His latest project was an old colonial home, one that had been abandoned for decades. It was a little rundown, but structurally sound, or so he thought. The first few weeks were normal. Jack spent his days repairing the roof, fixing the plumbing, and repainting the walls. But as he started to tear down some of the older walls to rewire the house, he found something strange. Behind one of the walls in the basement, buried deep in the plaster, was a small wooden box. It was covered in dust, as if it had been there for centuries. Jack opened it out of curiosity and found a collection of old, black and white photographs. They were all of the same family, a mother, a father, and their young daughter. But the more Jack looked at the photos, the more he noticed something unsettling. In the background of every picture, there was a shadowy figure, tall, indistinct, but always there, lurking behind the family. That night, as Jack worked late into the evening, he heard a noise, scratching, coming from inside the walls. At first, he thought it was just a rat, but the noise grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way out. He knocked on the wall, hoping to scare whatever it was away, but the scratching stopped. Then, from the darkness of the hallway behind him, came a low, rasping breath. Jack turned, his flashlight flickering in the dim basement, but there was nothing there. The house was silent again, but the feeling of being watched never left. Over the next few nights, the scratching returned, louder, more insistent, always coming from within the walls. Jack tore open the plaster, determined to find the source, but there was nothing behind the walls. No rats, no animals, just the hollow, empty spaces of the house. But the noises didn't stop. They followed him throughout the house, from room to room, always just beyond his reach. And sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear a voice, faint, whispering, telling him to leave. One evening, as he sat in a living room, exhausted from days of work, the scratching came again. This time, it was louder, closer. Jack stood, gripping his hammer, and followed the noise to the basement door. When he opened it, he saw the wall at the far end of the basement bulging, as if something was pushing against it from the inside. The scratching grew deafening, the wall shaking with each clawing motion. Suddenly, the wall cracked, splitting open to reveal a pair of eyes staring out at him, cold, hollow, and filled with rage. The next morning, Jack's truck was found abandoned outside the house. The basement wall had caved in, leaving a gaping hole, but Jack was gone. The only thing left was the box of photographs, sitting neatly on the floor, the last picture now showing the shadowy figure standing right behind him. Story 26. The Lantern in the Woods. There was a stretch of forest on the outskirts of town where no one ever went. The locals called it the Silent Woods, named for its unnatural stillness. No birds, no animals, just trees that seemed to absorb every sound. The only thing more unsettling than the silence were the stories. Those who entered the woods after dark were said to never return. Lucy had heard the tales growing up, but she never believed them. One autumn night, after a fight with her boyfriend, she stormed out of the house and, without thinking, wandered toward the edge of the silent woods. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the trees as she walked deeper into the forest. It wasn't long before the silence became suffocating. There were no crickets, no wind, just the sound of her own footsteps crunching through the leaves. But then, faintly at first, she saw it, a small, flickering light in the distance. A lantern. Curiosity got the better of her, and she followed the light. It seemed to sway gently, moving through the trees, always just ahead of her. As she drew closer, she realized something strange. The lantern wasn't being held by anyone. It floated suspended in the air, leading her deeper into the woods. Lucy's heart raced, but she couldn't stop. It was as if the light had some kind of hold on her, pulling her toward it. The deeper she went, the denser the trees became, until the path was completely gone, swallowed by the forest. Suddenly, the light disappeared. Lucy was plunged into darkness, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She spun around, trying to find her way back, but the woods were disorienting, every tree looking the same. Panic set in as she realized she was lost. And then, from behind her, she heard it, a soft rustling, like someone, or something, moving through the trees. The sound was slow, deliberate, drawing closer with each step. She turned, and there it was, the lantern, flickering weakly in the distance. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind the light stood a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden beneath the shadows of the trees. The lantern swayed again, beckoning her closer. Lucy ran. For hours, she stumbled through the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast she ran, the lantern always appeared ahead of her, leading her deeper and deeper into the woods. When the search party found her the next morning, she was standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide and blank, muttering the same words over and over. The lantern, it's still out there. She never spoke again, and to this day, no one dares enter the silent woods after dark. But every once in a while, on a cold, clear night, someone will see it, a faint, flickering light, moving through the trees, waiting for its next victim. Story 27. The Grinning Man. The town of Winterbrook was small, a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone. So when strange things began happening, it didn't take long for the rumors to start. People spoke of a man, tall, thin, with a strange, twisted smile, who had been seen walking the streets late at night. They called him the Grinning Man. Maya first heard about him from her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived across the street. Mrs. Thompson swore she had seen him standing outside her window at 3 a.m., his face pressed against the glass, grinning that eerie, unnatural grin. Maya didn't believe her at first. After all, the idea of a strange man lurking around town sounded more like an urban legend than reality. But then she started hearing the whispers, more and more people claiming to have seen him, always at night, always smiling. One night, as Maya was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on the pavement. Her heart raced as she slowly approached the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There he was. A man, standing at the end of her driveway, tall and thin, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlight. His grin was wide, too wide, stretching across his face in a way that didn't seem possible. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring up at her window. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. She quickly closed the curtain, her hands trembling. When she looked again, he was gone. The next night, the same thing happened. She heard the footsteps, looked out the window, and there he was, standing a little closer this time. His grin seemed even wider, his eyes fixed on her. Again, he disappeared the moment she looked away. Night after night he returned, each time standing a little closer until he was right outside her house, his face just inches from the glass. Terrified, Maya called the police, but by the time they arrived, the grinning man was gone. They'd found no evidence of anyone being there, no footprints, no signs of entry. But Maya knew what she had seen. The final night, she awoke to the sound of footsteps inside her house. Her heart raced as she crept out of bed, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. Slowly, she opened it and stepped into the hallway. There, at the end of the hall, stood the grinning man, his face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. His grin was wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with a twisted delight. He took a step toward her, and then another. His grin never faltered. Maya screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. The next morning, her house was empty. No one ever saw Maya again. But sometimes, on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the faint sound of footsteps outside, accompanied by a soft, eerie laugh. The grinning man is still out there, waiting for his next victim. Story 28. The Old Well's Whisper. In a forgotten village nestled deep in the mountains, there was an old stone well. The villagers never went near it, not since the night a little girl had fallen in over 50 years ago. They said her cries could still be heard, echoing up from the bottom of the well on quiet, moonless nights. Sophia didn't believe in ghosts or curses. When she moved to the village to escape the noise of the city, the stories about the well seemed more like folklore than anything sinister. But after a few months, curiosity gnawed at her. She had heard the whispers from her neighbors, warnings not to go near the well after dark, not to listen if she heard the voice calling. One night, she decided to see the well for herself. It was a cold, starless night, the village shrouded in an eerie silence. As she approached the well, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder. The stone was slick with moss, and as she peered over the edge, all she could see was a bottomless black void. Then, faintly, she heard it. A soft, fragile voice drifting up from the darkness. "Help me, please." Sophia froze, her heart pounding. The voice was that of a child, thin, desperate, and weak. She backed away from the well, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Please, I'm trapped. Help me." She knew the story, knew the girl had been lost decades ago. It wasn't possible. And yet, the voice tugged at her, pulling her toward the edge once more. Her hands gripped the stone, her knuckles white as she leaned forward, straining to see into the darkness below. Suddenly, the voice stopped. And then, from the depths of the well, she heard a laugh. A deep, guttural sound, nothing like the voice of a child. It echoed through the night, and before Sophia could react, something cold and wet wrapped around her ankle, yanking her toward the edge. She screamed, pulling back with all her strength. The grip loosened just enough for her to break free, and she stumbled away, heart racing. The well was silent now, but Sophia knew something was down there, something that had been waiting for years. The next day, she packed her bags and left the village without a word. The well still stands, waiting for the next person who dares to listen. Story 29. The Faces in the Window. Ella had always loved old houses, so when she found the perfect Victorian home on the outskirts of town, she couldn't believe her luck. The house was beautiful, large, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows that caught the light just right. The only odd thing about the place was the previous owner's insistence that she keep the drapes closed at night. Ella thought it was a strange request, but she agreed. For the first few nights, she followed their advice, pulling the heavy drapes shut before bed. But curiosity soon got the better of her. One night, after settling into bed, she left the drapes open, wanting to see the moonlight filter through the old windows. Around midnight, she woke to a strange feeling, like someone was watching her. Drowsy, she glanced toward the window and froze. There, standing outside, was a face. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The figure stood motionless, staring directly at her through the glass. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed to close the drapes. But as she approached the window, she saw more figures, dozens of them, standing silently in the yard, their faces pressed against the glass, watching her with unblinking eyes. She slammed the drapes shut and backed away, trembling. For hours she sat in the dark, listening to the faint sound of scratching at the windows. But she didn't dare open the drapes again. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a nightmare. But every night, when the sun set, the scratching returned, and she knew the faces were still out there, waiting for her to open the window once more. She moved out a week later. The house remains empty now, its drapes permanently closed. But sometimes, late at night, passers-by swear they can see faces in the windows, staring out from the shadows.